Hi everyone. I'm Alexis Alvarez Nakagawa, founding co-director of the Forum on the Center in the Human and chair of today's book launch. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Chef Sebo, who will be discussing his latest book with us today, The Moral Circle, which was published this year by Norton Press. Following a brief introduction by Dr. Sebo, we will have two commentators as well, Dr. Kimberly Deal and Dr. Shona Denitire, who will share some thoughts on the book. So we will then open the floor for questions from all of you. Before we begin, let me introduce our main speaker today. Dr. Chef Sebo is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at New York University. There, he is also affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, and law. He directs the Animal Studies MA program and the Mind Ethics and Policy program. He also co-directs the Wild Animal Welfare Program, and he researches in moral philosophy, legal philosophy, and the philosophy of mind. He is the author, of course, of the book he is presenting today, The Moral Circle, and also of another book, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. So, Chef, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is completely yours, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your new book.
All right. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for hosting this event and bringing these speakers together. And then also everybody here on the call today, and then people in the future viewing it. Thanks for taking the time to be here with us. So just to reinforce the plan for this session, we will be spending an hour talking. I will start by doing a brief summary of the book, and then we can have some more detailed commentary back and forth, and then plenty of time for questions and comments and discussion from the people who are here today. So really looking forward to hearing what everybody thinks, especially Kimberly and John. So this book, again, is called The Moral Circle, was published within the past month or so in the US, I believe more recently than that in the UK and elsewhere. And the book is a call for very significantly expanding the moral circle. In other words, very significantly expanding the scope of the moral community, our sense of to which beings we are accountable, to which beings we have responsibilities. Historically, of course, at least in the West, our understanding of the moral circle has been quite narrow. We have extended moral consideration to select humans, the occasional charismatic companion animal, but not to the vast number and wide range of other beings with whom we interact regularly. Yet we have consistently scaled up our interactions with a vast number and wide range of non-humans. And that includes, of course, non-human animals. And increasingly recently, it includes new kinds of minds, like digital minds, AI systems, robots, and chatbots. And so we face the question, should we extend consideration to at least some of these beings? And if so, which ones, and what follows for our responsibilities to them and our place in the moral universe, our presumption of human exceptionalism, this idea that we always matter most and we always take priority. And what I argue is that these questions are important because we are, for better or worse, in control and regularly making high stakes decisions about how to affect other beings. And yet these questions are very difficult because they sit at the intersection of some of the hardest problems in science and philosophy. In terms of ethics, we have ongoing substantial disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to matter. Do you need to be sentient, capable of suffering? Is it enough to be conscious, capable of having experiences of any kind? Or is it enough to be agentic, capable of setting and pursuing your own goals? And then on the science side, we have a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about which beings possess those capacities. For example, which animals are sentient and conscious, capable of experiencing pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering? Can AI systems one day be sentient and conscious? Experts disagree about that. And I expect that that disagreement and uncertainty will persist. We are not on the cusp of having a secure theory of moral standing or a secure theory of consciousness, for example, about which we can have anything approaching consensus or certainty. And so what I argue in the book is that when we recognize both the importance and the difficulty of these questions, we see the need for caution and humility in decision-making about how to treat non-humans of uncertain consciousness and moral status, for example. And in particular, we have a responsibility to extend at least some consideration to non-humans who have at least a realistic, non-negligible chance of being sentient or otherwise morally significant, given the evidence available to us, in the spirit of caution and humility. But then I also argue that when we take seriously everything that we currently know and do not know about non-humans, ranging from vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, to invertebrates, cephalopod mollusks, decapod crustaceans, insects, to AI systems, robots, chatbots, not only at present, but especially in the future, once they have more advanced and integrated capacities for perception and attention and learning and memory and decision-making and so on. When we take all of that seriously, we recognize that many of those beings, at the very least, all vertebrates, many invertebrates, and some near future AI systems, have a realistic, non-negligible chance of being sentient or otherwise morally significant, given the evidence available to us. And so I think we have a responsibility to extend at least some consideration right now to all vertebrates, many invertebrates, including insects, and some near future AI systems, including both robots and chatbots. And that constitutes more than a quintillion individuals alive at any given time now, and perhaps an even larger number, even wider range of beings moving forward. And so what I argue later in the book, and I can close my initial remarks here, is that this radical moral circle expansion calls into question our presumption of human exceptionalism. It challenges this idea that we always matter most, that we always take priority. I argue we ought to prioritize ourselves to an extent for various practical reasons and relational reasons, but we ought to treat non-humans much better than we do now, while investing in the knowledge, capacity, and political will needed to treat them still better in the future. And as we collect that knowledge, that capacity, that political will, as we improve our ability to care for non-humans, we will have a correspondingly higher responsibility to care for non-humans. And if all goes well, we might eventually have the ability and the responsibility to prioritize them over ourselves. And that would be a wonderful situation to be in. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and looking forward to the comments.
Thank you so much, Chef. That's super interesting. And I'm sure that you will have a lot of questions from the audience. But before that, let me, I will now pass it on to Dr. Kimberly Deal. Dr. Kimberly Deal is an environmental ethicist and an assistant professor of philosophy at Santa Clara University, and she will also share her ideas, her thoughts on the book.
Thank you, Alexis. And thank you, Jeff, for writing such a fantastic and accessible introduction to some pretty core problems in the philosophy of animal minds, but also how these issues intersect with environmental philosophy and ethics. For example, one of the problems that's brought up as a sort of difficult question that we must face if we include a multiplicity of beings in our moral circle is how at times to weigh the competing interests of individual entities who have a non-negligible chance of being, say, sentient or conscious, that property that grounds moral consideration on the one hand, and collectives of individuals, for example, ecosystems or even planetary systems. But for the purposes of my comments today, I want to focus on what I think is a kind of novel exploration in this particular text. And that is the potential inclusion of artificial intelligence systems as being the sorts of entities that in the not so distant future, as you and Robert Long argue elsewhere, by 2030, have a non-negligible or a 1 in 1,000 chance of bearing that property, whether it be affective sentience, consciousness, phenomenology, agency, etc. And so one of the conclusions of this attribution, this scientific claim, right, that probabilistically there's a non-negligible chance that these beings could in the future be sentient, agential, or conscious, is that they too ought to be included in our moral circle. Of course, as you note, Jeff, this doesn't tell us anything about the moral weight we ought to give these entities, but it does suggest caution. And so the question that I have for you, and I suppose this is intermingled with a commentary, is how considerations about our obligations to future artificial intelligence systems may or may not bear on the animal ethics and environmental duties that we have here and now today. So in a way, this is an iteration of Derek Parfit's identity problem, what you so cleverly sort of renamed the swan identity problem when applied to animal and environmental ethics. And I'll take this a step further by calling it something like the silicon identity problem. So in short, a lot of animal and environmental ethicists, including myself, are currently concerned about the heavy monetary attention and time investment in the development of artificially intelligent systems. For example, great LLMs like ChatGPT or Cloud Sonnet 3.1 currently utilize many environmental resources, which speed up, for example, pollution of various sorts and contribute to rising global temperatures. With this in mind, when we ask ourselves questions about the ethical status of AI, some of the questions that come to mind are not just about whether we ought to treat them well in the future once they come into being, but whether we have reason for example, refraining from investing in their development here and now today. After all, there are so many pressing global problems currently facing us: the biodiversity crisis, pollution en masse, and climate change, to name the triple planetary crisis, or just a few. With this in mind, does anything in your view about the expansion of the moral circle talk about our obligations to current biodiverse individuals and ecosystems, and how that might weigh against, again, the consideration of AI in particular? So with this in mind, I wanted to sort of push back on the way in which the introduction of AI is presented in the book itself. So I love that you utilize many fantastic and easy to approach thought experiments in order to sort of pump the reader's intuition and introduce the various views under discussion. And I especially like that you start the book with a discussion that incorporates the reader into the thought experiment itself. So you say, imagine a case wherein you share a house, you have roommates with two fantastic people, Carmen and Dara. You have a fantastic set of relationships, a robust sense of habits and shared experiences that you share with Dara and Carmen. But over time, you discover that Carmen turns out not at all to be a member of the species Homo sapiens. She's not, in other words, a human being, but is a Neanderthal on the one hand. And Dara, by contrast, turns out she's a silicon-based robotic analog who looks very much like a human being, but who is in fact not. She is, in short, a robot, maybe even an artificially intelligent system of sorts. And so with this thought experiment, we introduce the possibility that other beings, those that are more than human on the one hand and who are carbon-based, who share an evolutionary history with us, like Carmen, right, the Neanderthal, are the kinds of beings that ought to be included in our moral circle. And you give a really wonderful and fantastic series of arguments to justify that claim. You also suggest that Dara, right, because she's the kind of person that we can have a relationship with in this thought experiment, also is the kind of being whom has a non-negligible probability of being sentient, conscious, agential, and is the kind of being with whom we are entered into a robust, meaningful relationship. And again, on the basis of that intuition, you then articulate background arguments to justify the view that Dara, too, silicon-based though she may be, ought to be included within our moral sphere of considerability. So let us notice that this thought experiment is articulated in the context wherein Dara has already been fabricated by her fantastic developers, perhaps in Silicon Valley, near where I live. But it doesn't push the question back into the moment wherein the developers are asking themselves, do we have a duty to refrain from investing in a technology that may in fact create more environmental harms than benefits, even if we might, and here comes the silicon identity problem, create in the process of this scientific and technological exploration the kind of being who has the capacity for fantastic amounts of welfare, for wonderful experiences, for a robust kind of phenomenal and effective experience. And so I don't think that I disagree with the view in the world wherein the silicon-based life forms already exist, wherein AI is already robust. Absolutely, given the fantastic arguments in this book, they ought to be included in the moral circle. But from the perspective of those of us who are thinking about these issues today, do you think there's a reason to divert our resources away from, for example, AI and silicon-based robotic development and into, for example, environmental conservation? Why or why not? So thank you so much for a fantastic text. I look forward to our back and forth.
Thank you, Kimberly. That's fantastic. I'm sure Chef will want to respond to that, but before that, let's turn to Dr. Shona Denitire. Shona Denitire is a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary, and he also co-directs the Forum on the Center in the Human with me. So, Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak about Jeff's work, Jeff's latest work, and also, of course, to hear some of the thoughts that Kimberly has given. I first want to congratulate Jeff on this big achievement. Publishing a book is always a labor of love, and from my conversations with him, I know that it's taken some time and some considerable labor, but I have to say that this is definitely worth it for many reasons, including some that I'm going to expand on today. So first of all, congratulations, Jeff, for this achievement. I think another reason to congratulate Jeff is the ability that he's had in this book to speak to an audience that goes beyond the academy. This is, after all, a trade book, and he is able to distill various hyper complicated ideas in especially moral philosophy in a way that is understandable and actually personable. One example that Kimberly gave was of these three flatmates. One of them turns out to be part of the species of Neanderthal, and the other one turns out to be a robot. And so I think this is another reason why Jeff deserves high praise, because he's able to think about these issues and speak about these issues in a way that resonate with individuals that are not experts in the field. Yet, the fact that his account is personable doesn't mean that it doesn't have nuance. In fact, there's much nuance and complexity in the book. So congratulations, Jeff, for finding the right balance between accessibility and nuance. And I think the last reason I have to congratulate Jeff is that engaging with this book actually did something rare in the academy, which is to change people's mind. He actually changed my mind on some of the issues I've been thinking for a few years. In fact, when I first met Jeff in person, our first conversation, I think, goes back to 5 or 6 years ago in Oxford, and I was conveying to him my skepticism about our obligations to future generations in terms of both humans and non-human animals. So let me explain how, by engaging with Jeff's latest book, I have changed my mind about that skepticism. So I write in the field of mostly animal rights law and animal ethics. And in fact, I've recently published a book called Animals and the Constitution Towards Sentience-Based Constitutionalism. To cut the long story short, in the book, I argue that together with Dr. Rafael Fazel, who is my co-author, that a necessary, or I should say that a sufficient condition for moral inclusion is sentience, okay? So the moral circle that we currently have should be expanded from humans to all sentient beings, in particular sentient animals. And thinking of sentience as the criterion for moral inclusion brings up this related puzzle. That is, well, if only sentient beings matter for our moral deliberations, and importantly, if only sentient beings are entitled to rights, such as right to life, right to liberty, right to autonomy, etc., then I don't seem to have a good basis for thinking that future generations of both humans or animals have any rights or any entitlements because they are not sentient. They may be sentient at a certain point in time, of course, but at the very present, we have no duties to them because they have no rights. They only have rights when they become sentient. Now, this argument, if true, is troubling because, especially as Kimberly already spoke about, we seem to think to have serious duties in relation to environmental climate change, for example. That is, we have duties to, it seems there's an intuition that we have duties to preserve our planet for the benefit of future generations. But if my account of our moral circle is limited to only sentient beings, then you can see why this thought, my own conclusions, makes me uncomfortable. It entails that we have no duties to combat climate change or environmental degradation unless, and only unless, there are sentient beings now, at the very moment, that could be affected by our action. Now, by reading Jeff's book, I have been able to maybe unshackle myself from some of these assumptions that troubled me, actually. That is, I do think intuitively that we have some kind of duties to future generations, but my own account of sentience precludes recognizing that future generations have rights. But if I take the invitation of Jeff seriously, and I take it to heart, that we should be modest about our basis for including or excluding people from the moral circle, because we have been wrong about it before, and it's possible that we are wrong about it today, then I need to be more humble and be open to other criteria for moral inclusion. And importantly, and I think this is the strongest convincing part of Jeff's book, that including people within the moral circle doesn't mean that everyone is entitled to rights. It just means that the individuals or the entities that are included in the moral circle have some degree of merit, some degree of consideration. So translating into my own framework, it doesn't mean that future generation must have strong rights, like the right to life. Of course, they are not alive today, or the right to free speech. Of course, they cannot speak today. But it means that our moral framework should be able to give them some consideration. so that morality is not just a matter of rights, of strong rights or fundamental rights that people have today or should have today, but includes even precautionary thinking about the actions that we take today, how they may affect individuals in the future. That doesn't, of course, mean that people in the future have the same rights, the same entitlements, or should be given the same moral weight as people living today or sentient beings living today, but that those sentient beings in the future deserve at least serious consideration in our own frame. So I conclude by congratulating Jeff again for at least these 3 achievements, and there are many more, as you will see when you have the chances of engaging with the book. So thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you, Sean. That's fantastic. Chef, would you like to respond to the comments before we open the floor to the audience?
Sure. I can, offer a brief response and do my best to keep it brief. I also note that one person in the comments appears to be having trouble hearing us. I will say on my end, I have been able to hear Kimberly and John well, but if other people are having trouble hearing, please let us know in the comments. So thank you so much to both of you for, first of all, taking the time to read the book, and then second of all, offering such generous commentary. I obviously really appreciate that, and also appreciate your questions and comments. I will try to limit myself to replying to maybe one substantive point from each of you, but then we can, of course, expand on the conversation during the broader discussion with the audience. So Kimberly, on the one hand, yes, I completely agree with you that we face further questions not addressed in the book about creation ethics, as well as population ethics and environmental ethics. And you note, we agree that if we do create potentially sentient or otherwise morally significant AI systems, then we do have a responsibility to treat them with consideration and respect and compassion in the spirit of caution and humility. And then what you ask is, should we create them in the first place, given that we would then have those obligations to them, predictably, and there might then be tensions or trade-offs introduced between what is owed to them and what is owed to humans and other animals. And that could take a variety of forms. For example, there could be tensions, as I note in the book, between AI safety and AI welfare, between what types of policies are needed to prevent AI systems from harming humans and other animals versus what types of policies are needed to prevent humans from harming AI systems. But what you note is that there would also be tensions introduced due to environmental ethics and, at present, the large energy and climate footprint attributed to large language models and other power-hungry AI systems. Now, I will note that expert assessments of those energy requirements vary, and some experts do project that more efficiency will lead to fewer energy requirements in the future. But setting that aside, if we do suppose that there in an ongoing way will be large energy requirements, what follows for the ethics of creating them in the first place? Well, as it happens, I agree with you that for various reasons, we ought to be very cautious about creating not only very powerful AI, but also potentially morally significant AI, because we are racing towards the development of AI systems that will be very intelligent, potentially sentient, otherwise significant. And that just does exacerbate AI safety risks, as well as AI welfare risks, as well as, at least at present, energy consumption and environmental risks. And so I take it to be overdetermined that we ought to slow down, pause the development of increasingly sophisticated AI systems until we can get our acts together and figure out how to develop them in a way that can be safe and beneficial for humans and animals and AI systems at the same time. Now, we also live in the real world where we are in a kind of arms race where companies and governments are racing towards the development of these systems. And so while I do think that we ought to slow down, pause the development of these systems. I also do want to be facilitating a societal conversation or contributing to a societal conversation about what we would or will owe them if we did or do create them. But yes, I agree with you. Now, the final caveat I will offer, and then I can turn to briefly responding to John, is that I would not want to overcorrect in this direction, because of course we do, I think rightly, permit, even celebrate the ongoing creation of new humans and other animals, despite the fact that we have an energy footprint and a climate footprint. And I would not want, for example, to be overly moralistic about people having babies and creating a new generation of humanity simply because that will involve more energy consumption and a larger climate footprint. I think that before we really moralize and prohibit the act of creating new humans, we ought to figure out how a large human population can live more efficiently and sustainably and share the planet with other animals. And so I would want to bring the same kind of frame to the creation of new non-humans, including animals and AI systems. Instead of simply moralizing this and prohibiting it on those grounds alone, I would want to first ask, how can we find that efficiency and allow for that peaceful, harmonious, sustainable coexistence between humans and animals and AI systems? But this is, of course, a much broader conversation. Now, John, thank you so much, first of all, for your, again, generous remarks about the book. And obviously, I really admire your work as well. And it really means a lot to hear that you appreciate the balance that I struck between rigor and accessibility, but then also that you found yourself changing your mind a little bit about what is quite a core issue, whether we have duties to future generations. And I agree with you. Part of why I changed my mind over the course of writing the book is because I was taking seriously the need to extend some consideration to insects, AI systems, other non-humans. But then when I really started to reckon with not only descriptive uncertainty, but also normative uncertainty, I found myself grudgingly feeling the need to go farther. In your case, it was future generations. In my case, and this is a nod to Kimberly's work, it was plants and fungi, maybe microscopic organisms, and that was a surprising result for me. And likewise, as you were saying, it was a result of taking moral uncertainty seriously and wanting to give a little bit of weight to these beings because other theories of moral standing might be true for everything I can currently tell. Now, with respect to your point about future generations, hey, moral uncertainty compels me, John, to give at least some consideration to future generations, despite the fact that my own favorite account of rights implies that they do not presently deserve rights or are not presently owed the kinds of duties that would correspond to rights that they may form in the future. I will just note that kind of has an interesting similarity with a view that has sometimes been proposed in the animal ethics literature, which is a kind of Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals. This idea that humans deserve rights and should be treated as ends and not sacrificed for the greater good. Animals might not deserve that, but we should at least give consideration to their interests and weight to their interests and incorporate those into our welfare assessments and when we are attempting to promote good outcomes. And what you were saying about future generations kind of strikes me as a similar sort of view, but applied in that context. And if nobody has done it yet, John, you should consider writing a paper about Kantianism for the present, utilitarianism for the future. It might be interesting to see what follows from that kind of view in this sort of context. Now, I will then probably write a critical response because I think that we should attribute rights to the future. They might not have those rights at present, but they will have those rights by the time our actions reach them. And so we should consider the rights that we expect them to have when performing the actions that will eventually reach them when they have those rights. But I won't argue for that now. I just look forward to offering that response if you write your Kantianism for the present, utilitarianism for the future paper at some point in the near future. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks again to both of you and looking forward to hearing what others have to say.
Okay, thank you, Chef, for those responses. Thank you so much. So we now have some time for questions, around half an hour. So feel free to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand to ask them directly.
I think if I may, until we have other
Yeah.
people asking questions, if I can just give a brief response to Jeff. I feel very uncomfortable with his response because I really don't like utilitarianism very much. I'm an anti-utilitarian, even though I know that Jeff has some sympathies with that moral tradition. So reframe the way you phrase my position actually accurately, I think, describes what my own present intuition. So I think I will have to engage more with the rights-based framework for future generations, just because I'm not very sympathetic to this utilitarianism at all. So thank you again for inspiring some more thoughts on this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I see some questions are starting to come in. I will just briefly say by way of response, and then we can turn to some questions, that, yeah, fair enough. I do think that both due to moral uncertainty and the need for coalition building, despite disagreement about moral theory, that it helps to adopt a kind of pluralistic framework that incorporates elements from utilitarianism, Kantianism, virtue theory, care theory, other leading ethical frameworks. And with that said, I can appreciate, of course, that you might have reservations about utilitarianism. You might give less weight to it under uncertainty. Fair enough. I will say, maybe as a kind of possible concession, that you could also consider rights with discounted weights. So obviously there are different kinds of rights theories. Some regard rights as absolute and having incomparable or infinite amount of weight, such that no amount of other considerations could outweigh them. But other rights frameworks do assign weights to rights. And then you can have some rights carrying greater weight such that it takes more to override them, and other rights carrying lesser weight. And a lot of animal rights theorists do make this move. They attribute rights to animals. It takes a lot to override them, but it takes less to override an ant's right to life than a human's, for example. And if you discount for the future for various reasons, then you might think of them similarly, that they do have rights, that it does take something to override them, but that it takes less to override the rights of somebody living 1,000 years from now than somebody living 500 years from now, and similarly today. So that might be another avenue that you could consider, just throwing it out there.
So we now have some questions from the audience. We have a question from Lawrence. So should I read aloud, or Lawrence, would you like to ask your question? Okay, I will read aloud then. Lawrence asks, or says, Chef mentioned he thinks it can be worldwide creating new humans into existence, and this may have implications for whether we should create AI. Can he share why he believes this, or where we can read about it?
Yeah, I do believe that it can be good to create more beings. I have a pretty simple view about creation ethics, which again, this is a complicated topic, and so I do have some uncertainty about it and want to give some weight to other views. But by default, the view that I find most plausible is the simple view that, all else being equal, it is good to create happy lives that contain ample positive welfare, and it is bad to create miserable lives that contain ample negative welfare. And so for me, a lot depends on whether we can expect the lives created to be worth living, to be better for the subject than non-existence. To the extent that we do have that expectation, I think, all else being equal, creating new lives is good. It adds value to the world, more people who can fall in love and listen to music and so on and so forth. And again, to the extent that we expect them to be miserable, then the reverse would be the case. Now, obviously, there are other considerations too, including what we would owe them, whether we can fulfill those responsibilities, what the indirect effects of creating them would be, what the environmental toll would be, et cetera, et cetera. All of that should be taken into account as well. But as a starting point, I am not the kind of asymmetrical antinatalist who holds that creating new lives is bad just because it introduces suffering, and suffering but not happiness matters, or anything like that. I think good lives are good. Happiness is good. Bad lives are bad. Suffering is bad, and we should take that into account when determining whether to bring into existence new, vulnerable, potentially sentient beings.
Wonderful. I will read two more questions together, if that's okay, Chef.
Mm-hmm.
So Amanda says, some animals like dolphins, for example, show advanced problem-solving skills. In your opinion, should intelligence factor into moral consideration alongside sentience? And then we have another question, which says, if we consider granting rights or at least moral consideration to sufficiently advanced and sentient AI, doesn't this challenge the foundational premise of AI's existence, that it is created solely to serve and assist human beings? Recognizing rights for AI implies that humans owe duties to these systems, potentially requiring us to limit our own freedoms or interests. How can we reconcile this with the fact that AI was developed specifically for human benefit, nor as an end in itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great questions. So regarding the first question about intelligence, there are different ways intelligence could matter for moral status. One is that there are some theories of moral status that treat intelligence or agency of a certain robust type as a sufficient condition for moral status, even in the absence of conscious experience like pleasure and pain. And so to the extent that you give weight to that kind of robust agency view about moral status or moral standing, then the fact that many non-human animals clearly exhibit goal-directed behavior and flexible decision-making, the fact that AI systems increasingly do that, that would be enough for giving moral consideration to these beings, even if we remain skeptical that it feels like anything on the AI side to be them. I do think it feels like something to be a dolphin, to be clear. Now, the other way it can matter is that it can inform what your interests and needs and vulnerabilities are, and therefore what specifically we owe you as a morally significant being. So for example, if dolphins have a greater capacity for intelligence and flexible decision-making than individual ants do, suppose for the sake of discussion that this is true, then that might mean that a dolphin requires greater environmental enrichment, the opportunity to solve puzzles, the opportunity to solve problems, to make decisions. That would mean that the dolphin requires those sorts of goods to a greater extent than the ant does in order to flourish in life and be as happy as possible. So those are the respects in which I do think that evidence concerning intelligence might matter, both for whether you deserve consideration and then what kind of consideration you deserve. Now, regarding the second question about AI, I agree. We have, in the first instance, developed AI systems as tools for human use, not as subjects with intrinsic value. And so if we then realize that, they are, or at least might be, subjects with intrinsic value, then we will need to reckon with this instrumentalizing attitude that we had when creating them. Now, this, of course, would not be the first time we have had to reckon with this kind of tension that is introduced when we create potentially morally significant beings without initially recognizing their moral significance. With the vast majority of captive animals, we are fundamentally in the same situation. With farmed animals, we created them for human consumption. With lab animals, we created them for human science and medicine. Even companion animals, we often create them to have features that we find cute and valuable for us, rather than features that are good for them, even when we use them for companionship and social and emotional bonds. And so we have had fundamentally instrumentalizing, even objectifying attitudes and orientations towards non-human animals, then we create them, and then they exist, and then they matter for their own sakes, even though we created them in those conditions. And then farmed animals are screwed because not only are they in this condition of captivity, but also we bred them to grow as big as possible, as fast as possible. And lab animals are screwed, not only because they exist in these conditions of captivity, but because we bred them to have cancer and other diseases so that we can study them, and so on and so forth, with companion animals with smushed noses that we find cute that give them respiratory issues and so on. So I think now with the animals, we need to reckon with that reality and ask, what would it look like to, instead of having those practices where we intentionally give them features that are good for us but not necessarily good for them, and then we subject them to lives of servitude, what would it look like to instead create them such that they can have features that are kind of harmoniously aligned, that are good for us and good for them, where we can then have a kind of harmonious coexistence where, yes, maybe they can still perform tasks that are good for humans. Maybe they can still enter data into spreadsheets for us and write essays or edit essays for us, but they can also have at least some freedom to pursue their own goals or take breaks in ways that are still compatible with safety for humans and other animals. What might that look like? I think those are the sorts of questions that we could ask if we succeeded in coordinating on slowing down this development of this technology. And then maybe we could create a kind of co-beneficial society and infrastructure for humans and animals and AI systems.
Great, fantastic. So we have more questions in the chat, but I think that Kimberly had a question as well. So Kimberly, would you like to ask your question? Yeah.
So I think that this is, in a way, a variation on Hannah's question. So I'm going to read her question, and then I'm going to interweave a question as well. So Hannah writes, if animals do have rights, what rights do they have? If they have the right to life, does this now mean killing animals and consequently eating them is unlawful? Should this go so far that people are legally required to be vegetarians and vegans? A society where everyone had to be vegetarian or vegan seems rather dystopian and unlikely to become a reality. So how would animal rights work in practice, considering one of the most basic rights is the right to life? And so my question, as a follow-up to Hannah's, has to do with some approaches in Indigenous philosophy. So for many Indigenous communities, for example, the Inuit or the Anishinaabe or the Nuu-chah-nulth in the Pacific Northwest, eating animals is not incompatible with attributing some degree of intrinsic value to them and moral status. In other words, many Indigenous philosophies, like that of the Nuu-chah-nulth and the Inuit and the Anishinaabe, interweaves the sort of consideration that being in the right kind of ecological relationship with the more than human animals whom one consumes is the necessary condition that matters in terms of moral considerability. And indeed, given their very complex metaphysical worldviews and backgrounds, the sort of distinction or dualism between the human community and the more than human community, say salmon, is not at all sharp or a distinction of kind. It's not one to easily disentangle. And so with that in mind, on your view, is there space for variation, for a pluralism about animal and environmental ethics that makes room for example, the consumption of salmon by the Nuu-chah-nulth people or sturgeon consumption by the Anishinaabe? And if the answer is no, a consequence of this sort of radical expansion of the moral circle is that we shouldn't eat animals in total. Do we end up finding ourselves in a kind of bind as Euro-descended environmental ethicists and animal ethicists, wherein there's a sort of imposition upon communities that have this kind of historical relationship to land that was and is sustainable?
Awesome. Thank you both for the question that you read and then for your own additional question, which I agree is related. I will try to be brief, but obviously this is a huge issue, so I may take just a few minutes to unpack an answer. So in general, when it comes to this book, The Moral Circle, my goal was to create a broad, pluralistic, ecumenical framework for agreeing on and building coalitions around at least some minimal ethical commitments that a reasonably wide range of frameworks can endorse for a reasonably wide range of reasons. And that includes, for example, a commitment to giving moral consideration to beings who are sentient and agentic, a commitment to considering realistic, non-negligible risks produced by our actions and policies, a commitment to reducing and repairing harms caused to vulnerable populations against their will by our actions and policies where possible, where achievable and sustainable. And I think those are relatively robust principles that a wide range of theories do endorse, and then they do collectively entail some surprising conclusions, like that we ought to give consideration to animals and AI systems, we ought to reduce and repair the risk that we impose on them where possible. Now, what does that mean for specific practices? I stop short of endorsing specific policy proposals in the book because I want to allow for discussion and negotiation across different frameworks and theories. And those would include, for example, the types of indigenous perspectives that you mentioned. I will say that my own view, which I do gesture at in the book, and then I discuss in more detail in a 2025 law review article called what is it called? Oh, Towards a Global Ban on Industrial Animal Agriculture by 2050. That is the name of my recent law review article. Towards a Global Ban on Industrial Animal Agriculture by 2050. What I argue there is, listen, there are a variety of animal production practices, a variety of animal consumption practices. However, the vast majority of animal protein is produced and consumed via a global system of industrial animal agriculture in both intensive and large-scale extensive forms. And that causes massive and unnecessary harm to humans and animals and the environment all at the same time, obviously causes a lot of animal suffering, causes a lot of public health risks, including antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance, the emergence of infectious diseases, a lot of environmental harm, land and water use, deforestation, pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change. So that, how about we start by agreeing, is bad, and we should work together to effect a just transition over the course of many generations, work together to effect a just transition away from industrial animal agriculture and towards alternatives that are better for humans and animals and the environment. Now, that does raise the question, which alternatives should be included in this just future food system? And should it be only plant-based foods, or should it also be like cultivated meats, or should it also be certain types of small-scale, extensive animal farming practices or hunting and fishing practices? And my proposal is just, how about we start by agreeing that we should work towards ending industrial animal agriculture on a reasonable timeline, and then we can spend those decades fighting about what alternatives we should be including in the just future food system. I think those are tough calls, and we should just agree to disagree about them for now while we work together on the big thing.
Fantastic. So we don't have much more time, so let me just pick maybe one last question, and I will read Omar's question about AI. And he says, given that the most powerful AIs will inevitably fall under the control of the most powerful governments, of the most powerful states, and I will also add of the most powerful corporations as well, how can it be morally correct to attribute any kind of rights to these entities? Well, he also said that human rights are repeatedly violated around the world, and governments are ready to use AIs to cause these kinds of violations. But I think he is mainly pointing out to the tension between, the current status of AI, which is mainly create, produce, and fostered by big corporations in big states, and this tension with actually giving rights to these entities that are, that in this context seems to be a kind of channel for these corporations and these big states.
Yeah, this is great question again. And this is really fraught because that is absolutely correct. AI right now is in the hands of the most powerful companies and governments in the world, and they of course are going to be incentivized to use it in order to further enrich and empower themselves. And that of course is one of the pathways towards AI safety risks, right? Like one risk is that powerful actors could lose control of AI, and then AI could act against their and our interests. But another risk is that they could retain control of AI and use it in order to further entrench their own power and control over the rest of the population. And those could all be really concerning scenarios. And now, as this question is pointing out, there are going to be similarly fraught questions to ask about the AI systems themselves. Their creators and controllers are perhaps going to be instrumentalizing and objectifying them in the same way that, again, we have with non-human animals in the context of factory farming and animal research and these other animal use industries. So all I can say right now is that if and when AI systems have a realistic chance of being sentient and otherwise morally significant, it will not be their fault that the individuals who create and control them are powerful, arguably corrupt companies and governments. They will still be owed consideration. And so it will be on us to fight for them having legal and political welfare protections or rights, despite the fact that their creators and controllers might not be fully incentivized to respect their rights voluntarily or promote their welfare voluntarily. Now, some actors within AI companies, some actors within governments do really care about this issue. The AI company, for example, Anthropic, hired an AI welfare officer recently, and they are really sincerely looking into AI welfare risks alongside AI safety risks. Now, is that going to be enough to ensure proper treatment of AI systems? In the fullness of time, I think the answer is likely no. As with animal welfare, we are going to need external oversight and regulation in order to ensure that companies follow through with their stated commitments to protecting AI systems. But those are just inevitably fights that we need to have. There is no silver bullet with these difficult issues. We just need corporate and governmental voluntary action. We need external pressure and incentives. We need education and advocacy. We need all of it in order to increase the probability of a good outcome.
Thank you so much, Chef. I think that our time is almost up, so we have just 3 minutes left, but that won't be enough to pick another question and to get a response. So thank you so much again, Chef. This is a fascinating work, and congratulations again. Thank you also, Sean and Kimberly, for your very insightful comments. I think that Sean pasted some of the details for the forum's upcoming events, so please join us in the future for the other events. And I think that it's everything for now. So thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you to the speakers, and congratulations to Chef.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Congratulations on a fantastic book, and thank you, Kimberly. As I posted in the chat, our next event is going to be on 17th of April, and you will hear from me again, and Alexis, as well as Cesar from NYU, and we are going to talk about non-human rights as a field of academic inquiry, as these 3 people, including myself, I've just mentioned, or are in the process of publishing books on non-human rights. So it's supposed to, I hope it will be a wonderful event, and I have pasted the link in the chat to where you can register. Sorry that we were not able to get to all of the questions, but time is always limited. Thank you, Alexis, for sharing. Thank you so much, and thanks again to Jeff and Kimberly, and most of all, thanks to the audience. Take care, everyone. Bye now.